want to welcome Dr. Doslin. Doslin is a researcher in literary texts with interest in their production mechanisms. Our research engages with the cultural and literary production in Africa with a focus on diverse literary platforms such as publishing and prize industries, book fairs and festivals, literary magazines and writers' organizations, exploring networks they create and the effects that they have on contemporary African literary production. Doslin is currently a research associate at the University of Bristol in the UK. Let's all welcome Doslin.
Thank you, Jean Posibori, for that introduction. I appreciate being here and I appreciate being part of this conversation on translation into different languages that are spoken in this country. To add on what I said yesterday, that this is part of a wider research project funded by the ERC, and we are interested in literary activism in sub-Saharan Africa, and we are working in Nigeria, specifically the northern part of Nigeria. We are working in Cote d'Ivoire and Cameroon and Kenya, the East African region. I'm focusing on the East African region, mostly on Kenya and Uganda. And when you're talking about literary activism, it's from the perspective of, we're looking at activism from two main perspectives. Activism in the text itself, so that we look at what the text is talking about and its role in literary activism within that socio-cultural context. And we are also interested in the platforms that host literature and looking at those platforms as a form of activism in themselves. That's why this process of translation becomes a form of activism for us, because it's speaking to identities. Like, we want to present our literatures in languages that are spoken here. And that is also part of speaking to ourselves, as opposed to the narratives about speaking to others or speaking to the West. So that when you're writing or translating between our different languages, it is a very conscious decision to speak to ourselves, as opposed to speaking to the rest or writing back to the empire. And in this presentation, I want to say that I'll be interested to get your opinions on what literary activism means to you, on what translation as activism means to you. And one of the methods in which we want to do this is through interviews. I've already started interviewing with some of you to seek your opinion one-on-one. And I'm hoping that even after this workshop, I can follow, we can continue the discussion, because I'm here in Kenya for, I think, until January, and we can continue the conversations. So if you feel the need, like we have to talk more, I can always organize so that we can have a one-on-one interview even after the workshop, because I know there is only so much we can do during this 2-day period in terms of interviews. But the other thing that I want to focus on specifically is on group discussions, like the focus group discussions. And I'm hoping that we'll have time in the afternoon. We should have maybe started in this session, but we are running short on time. So in the afternoon, we'll probably get into 2 different groups and then engage in these questions like directly in that small group, maybe of 8 to 9 people. But at the moment, what I want to do in this presentation before we go for tea break is that I'm going to present, I don't want to call it a presentation, but it's supposed to provide questions that will provoke the discussions that we'll continue having later in the afternoon. So I want to say that my presentation is based on provoking questions that have intrigued me in my reading in the context of literary activism and translation in Africa. These questions, I hope, will open up a wider discussion on the topic of literary translation, especially in the context of Kenya. And this is bearing in mind the fact that literary translation is subjective and is also highly shaped by the language and its socio-cultural context. And the topic of African writing and the use of language is a long one. It's a long one which we have dealt with. And it maybe you can say starting with the big question of what African literature is. And there are various views on language use in African literature, ranging from the authenticity in language and its geocultural location, to language adoption and audience and book markets in general. And as is already public knowledge, we know that there are more than 2,000 languages that are spoken on the continent of Africa, and in Kenya alone, there are more than 42 languages that are spoken here. And in this sense, therefore, when we talk about literature produced and translated into languages spoken in Kenya, there is always the gap in the number of languages that are used. In this writing translation workshop, for example, we have about 13 languages. Is that so, Kilolo? About 13, right? Counting the different dialects of Luya and not counting Luya as one language, isn't it? The most recent successful translation work into different languages spoken here, and thanks to Kilolo again, would be the Jalada Translation Project, and the short story that has been published into more than 100 languages that are spoken in Kenya and beyond the Kenyan borders. And I'm sure that we are all looking forward to the next translation project by Jalada. It will be featuring Shoinka, am I right? The next project. But before Jalada, perhaps we need to acknowledge the work done by the Ministry of Education in Kenya through the Curriculum Development and Research Center in the production of the TKK children's books in the 70s and the 80s that were published by Longman Publishers. And apart from the translation of the Bible in Kenya, or the in different languages spoken in Kenya, perhaps the TKK books were the next most translated text in Kenya. However, these were school textbooks, and in an era where the government promoted the teaching of younger children in mother tongue. And more recent literary translations have not been wide in terms of covering as many languages. And there are many reasons for this which have been explored in this workshop and will be explored further. And my point in this short summary of the history of literary translations in Kenya is linked to one of the two topics that I hope that we would be able to explore further in our discussion or conversation. And this is in the hierarchy of languages. And in this, I'm talking about, when we're talking about the translation between European languages and languages that are spoken in different parts of Africa, one of the problems that has always been there has been the power asymmetry in the languages, whereby European language literatures have been held at a higher level than the African languages. But I want to provoke a further question to ask, even as we are translating into our local languages, is there a danger that this power asymmetry, that the hierarchy of these languages is going to persist now that we are not even talking about translating between African languages and European languages, but between our own languages? Is there a danger for that? And as translators, what is it that we are doing about that? And as translators and people working in this area, what are we doing to ensure that a move to writing and translating in Kenyan and African languages does not lead to replacing one language with another and end up creating another kind of power asymmetry between the languages? Then the other topic that I would love to explore with you further as writers based in Kenya and those who use different languages to write, and also as language experts, is on the fluidity of languages that are spoken in Kenya. I'm particularly interested in the multilingual nature of Kenyan communication in informal setups and the challenges of formal presentation and representation in which one language is favored over others and also standardized. The spoken languages in Kenya, especially English, Kiswahili, and Sheng, are very powerful representations of the elasticity of the spoken language. However, this elasticity and the fluidity is rarely represented in literary text and literary translations. And in this regard, I am especially happy to see Makena Onjerika's Kane-winning short story, The Fanta Blackcurrant, as part of the translation work in this project. And I want to say thank you very much, Felix Omondi, for this translation from English to Sheng. So although the original text by Makena Onjerika was written and published in English, Onjerika successfully presents echoes of Sheng through the characters dialogue, and the setting. And I believe it's set in River Road, or the other side past River Road of Nairobi. My question here is on the space of this non-standard, for lack of a better word, language in the book market world. What is the place for translations into the in-between languages, such as those spoken in Kenya? And here I'm thinking of big literary pieces, such as Sam Sevlon's Lonely Londoners, that was written, I think, in 58, capturing 58 or early 60s. And it was capturing the language that was spoken by Caribbean immigrants to the UK in the 50s, 60s. Or probably more recently, Brian Chikwava's novel, Harare North, capturing the spoken language of Zimbabwean immigrants in the UK post-2000s. And I must acknowledge, however, the work done by Kwani in the production of literary text in Sheng in the 2000s and the 2010. Above this, it is also quite important to acknowledge the ever-evolving nature of Sheng as a language in Kenya. The use of language such as Sheng in literary spaces holds the power to capture the spirit of the moment and of a specific geographical space, like a town or a section of the city. It becomes a marker of specific geographical and historical moments. And one major example that has been talked about for many years would be for Sheng speakers, a word like unbogable takes you to a specific historical and political context in the Kenyan times. There are other words that are not specifically political. And in this context, I'm thinking of in the early 2010s, in South Africa, I met a Kenyan who told me words such as, I want to take my moti to the garage. We were supposed to have a meeting and her car was faulty, so she said, I want to take my moti to the garage. And in that small sentence, I was able to place her age, or the fact that the last time she had spoken Sheng, or the last time she lived in Kenya, was in the late 90s, early 2000, because that's when people used to refer to a car as moti, right? Meaning that the language keeps evolving very fast. The other thing is that, for example, because Nairobi is the hub of Sheng, but we all know that Sheng evolves in different sections of the city. Kuna Sheng ya Eastlands, even in that Eastlands, kuna sections bado. Kuna Sheng on the other side of Nairobi, and even there, they are all not standardized. So what I'm saying is, what spaces are available for translations into such languages? And by this, what I'm trying to do is to make a case for the standardization of orthography, and not just for Sheng, but for other languages that are spoken here. And because you are the experts in this field, you are the people that are working in this area, what are the options for this, especially for the standardization of orthography? And I must admit that I don't have specific answers to these questions, but my goal here is to provoke a conversation and seek your different opinions on these things. I want to summarize and say that some of the other issues that would really benefit my research is a discussion on what it means to you as translators or people that are working in these different languages, what visibility versus invisibilities of the translator means to you. The other thing would be to get your experience translating across different African languages, considering their shared histories or cultures and stuff like that, and then comparing this to the translation that is done across different foreign languages, and what that means to you specifically, because you're the people that are active in this field. But I'm hoping that this, my short presentation, would provoke our discussion when we start from there. Nashukuru sana.